Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 5 in our World Civilizations class. You should be here for topic 1 of this week, which is, as you can see, some independence movements in Latin America. We talked a lot last week, of course, about the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Now we're going to look at how some of those revolutions inspired other revolutions in Latin America. As always, we'll start off looking at the key terms. Please remember that this is where a lot of your information for content quizzes and writing assignments are going to come from. First up, we're going to look at the Haitian Revolution. Then we'll look at a couple of revolutionaries in Latin America called Jose de San Martin and Simon Bolivar. We'll look at the Mexican War for Independence and the Mexican-American War. Also, you have some upcoming dates to keep in mind, as usual. First off, your only assignment this week is going to be to get your writing assignment 2 done. It'll be due September the 25th at 5 p.m. The prompt, rubric, and submission area are already located in Moodle, so you should be able to get a head start on this. Also, your first debate is coming up on October the 2nd at 5 p.m. Now, the prompt, rubric, and submission area for this assignment are also already located in Moodle. The debate, however, will be scheduled over email and will be held over Zoom. Just to be clear, I think I've mentioned this a couple of times before, but just to make sure I'm absolutely clear, the actual debate will not necessarily be held on October the 2nd, and it definitely won't be held at 5 p.m. What's going to happen is I'll send out some emails, which I should have actually already done by the time you're viewing this. I'll send out some emails suggesting various times for us to hold the debate. Once we get one that most people can attend, we'll schedule the debate for that day. And then we'll, of course, hold it over Zoom. This date right here at 5 p.m. is just when the materials are going to be due for the debate. So as I'll discuss in more detail, the stuff you use to prepare for the debate, your outlines, and your research is what's going to be due at that time. Also, as I mentioned a few times before, there is an alternate assignment available for anyone who cannot actually participate in the debate. Since this is a completely online class, I can't force you to attend the meetings necessarily. So there is an assignment for those of you who cannot make it to the debate. This will also be due at the same time on October the 2nd at 5 p.m. Now, in the meantime, I want to give you a little bit of advice on your writing assignments since, of course, we have finished those and they have been graded. Overall, I was mostly pleased. But of course, there are some issues that I saw across the board that we can all improve on. First off, I want to spend quite a bit of time mentioning your thesis statements. As I've said before, your thesis statement is an important place where you state your argument. It can essentially dictate how well your argument is going to work throughout the entire paper. So you want to make sure you do a good job on this. Now, one couple of things I saw that we can all improve on, or most of us can improve on at least. First, make sure you're answering the question that's in the prompt. Example, I saw a few of you summarizing the major factors of colonization instead of doing as the prompt asked, which was to pick one factor of colonization that you thought was the most influential. Most of you who did this did a very good job still summarizing some of the major parts of colonization, but again, as I've said before, that's summary. I don't want you to summarize things, I want you to make clear arguments backed by evidence. So again, make sure you're focusing on what the prompt wants you to focus on. Make sure you're not biting off more than you can chew, and make sure that you're not doing too little. Because for another example, some of you would only address African colonization, or some of you would only address American colonization. It was, of course, a fairly small writing assignment. I don't expect you to cover every single thing. That's impossible. But some of you wouldn't mention the other nation or series of nations at all. Make sure you're addressing as much of the prompt as you can. Also, another big one I want to mention, don't argue against yourself. This wasn't as big of a problem with this class, but I want to give you an example from my American history class to show you what I mean. For their first writing assignment, I had them try to write an essay arguing whether or not Reconstruction was an improvement for African Americans after the Civil War. What quite a few of them would end up doing is they would state in their thesis that Reconstruction was an improvement, but they would spend their whole essay arguing about all the negative things that took away rights from freed African Americans. That really weakens your whole argument, because on the one hand, in your thesis, you say you're going to talk about how Reconstruction was an improvement, but you spend your whole time just talking about the negative things. That does not mean I don't want you to focus on negative aspects of history, of course. What I mean is, if you make an argument, stick with it. Don't argue against yourself. Also, this is a pretty basic one, and for the most part, we did a good job at this, but I just want to throw it out there still. Make sure you include your argument and your major supporting topics in your thesis statement. I think for some people, the problem is they might actually be overthinking this a little bit, which is definitely not the worst thing that can happen. It means that you're at least taking things seriously and putting a lot of effort in. But what I don't want you to expect you to put every single thing you're going to discuss in your essay in the thesis statement. I just want you to mention what your major topics are going to be that you're going to talk about throughout your body paragraphs. So, for example, let's say you were writing an essay about why Star Wars was better than Star Trek. This right here would be a fairly basic but a perfectly acceptable thesis statement. Star Wars is better than Star Trek because of its superior writing, cinematography, and acting. That is a good thesis statement. It clearly states what my argument is, and it outlines my major reasons why. It doesn't have to go into a ton of detail about what the writing was like, the cinematography was like, or what the acting was like. It just states the argument and tells you what each paragraph is going to be about. Make sure your thesis statements cover that in the future. Some more basic stuff. Structure, I want intro, body paragraphs, conclusion. So, this wasn't a very common problem, but a few of you would just have one giant paragraph. Make sure you follow a more traditional essay structure for these. Sources, make sure you include primary sources. It does not have to be a majority of primary sources that you use, but there need to be some in there. Also, in-text citations have to be there as well. If you don't use in-text citations to show me how you're using your sources, it can be very easy for someone to just make a works cited page, throw in random sources that they found without actually researching, and move on with their day. You need to show me that you're actually using your resource and not just throwing random stuff in there. Also, make sure you avoid large block quotes. A few of you would have very large block quotes that would take up a huge section of your essay, sometimes up to 40 or 50% of it. For this one was a bit more of a serious infraction. When you do this, it looks like you're either trying to pad out the word count by just putting someone else's work in there, or at the worst, it looks like you're almost attempting to plagiarize. I didn't get anyone for plagiarism this time because at the least, everyone who did this would cite the source, but it still looks like you're just trying to take up the word count and get as much done as you can without actually writing anything. What I want you to do is spend most of your time actually analyzing the sources, not just quoting them directly. So take a smaller section or just a little sentence or a sentence fragment from a source, and then spend more time interpreting it and explaining what it means and how it supports your argument in your own words. Because what a lot of people do with these block quotes is they would just put in the block quote that would take up almost the whole paragraph and then just have one sentence saying, that's why my argument is correct. That doesn't really explain anything. It doesn't explain your thoughts or your argument. It's just essentially you copying someone else's argument. Don't do that in the future. That will be graded pretty harshly as we continue. Which reminds me, I was somewhat lenient on the grading this time. All these things, since I wanted to, again, like I mentioned before, the first writing assignment was somewhat there for me to gauge your writing skills and to give you feedback on common problems. But now that I've given you some of this feedback, the grading is going to get a bit more strict as we continue. So make sure you keep that in mind. All right, and welcome back. I apologize for that bit of a delay. There was a technical issue for whatever reason, and I had to edit out a portion of this video. Hopefully it's working pretty well. But anyway, as I was saying, now we're going to move into some of the content that we're actually going to look at for today. Now, one thing I want you to think about as we go forward, how is the rest of the world maybe going to react to the revolutions in America and France? And, more specifically, how might America and Europe react to those reactions? So essentially, what is the rest of the world going to do? How are they going to be inspired by these revolutions? And how is America and Europe going to react? Are they going to be sympathetic to these revolutions? Or are they maybe going to be a little bit upset by them? A couple of interesting things to keep in mind. And again, I know 10 points from the most complicatedly worded question. I tend to like to make things more complicated than they need to be. Bit of a character flaw, I suppose. But anyway, revolutions did start to spread across the world after the American and the French Revolution. In 1781, in modern-day Haiti, the island at the time was split up. The eastern half was called Santo Domingo, which is ruled by the Spanish. The west half was called Saint Domingue, ruled by the French. Probably butchered the pronunciation again. The population at the time was around 30,000 whites, 28,000 mulattoes, or a mix between African Americans and white people, and 500,000 black slaves. Why is that population demographic going to be a bit of an issue? Pause for the audience at home. All right, but yeah, as you can probably guess, and it was an issue also in some American colonies and states like South Carolina, when you have a majority of your population as slaves, everyone else has to constantly live in fear of the idea that there could be an uprising. In Haiti, or as at the time as it was called, of course, Saint Domingo and Saint Domingue, this became a reality. In 1791, we had the first and one of the only successful African American slave revolts in the world. At the time, the Provincial Assembly refused to grant any rights that were promised by the French Revolution. Remember, we talked about last week that there were certain rights being fought over in the French Revolution: freedom of religion, a progressive tax system, end of the nobility, things like that. The French Assembly refused to give any of those rights to the Haitian people. In 1794, the British attempted to reconquer Saint-Domingue. Now, pause for a second. Why do you think they would get involved? Maybe based on some stuff we talked about last week. All right, yes, very good. It again shows the importance of empire and controlling resources and people for these empires when they're focused on mercantilism. The British wanted to take advantage of this chaos and gain this colony. However, they were unsuccessful. Between 1801 and 1803, the French attempted to retake the island, and they actually failed because yellow fever took out about 2/3 of their invasion force. So we talked quite a bit about how important disease was for allowing Europeans to conquer various colonies. This actually shows how disease could work the other way. By 1804, Saint-Domingue had actually been established as the nation of Haiti formally and was now controlled by a black emperor. Now, thinking about how people liked race relations at this time, how is this revolution going to maybe inspire others? And perhaps more importantly, how are the Western powers going to react to this? Again, awkward pause for the students at home. But yeah, as you might imagine, people who are oppressed in similar ways to how the Haitians were are of course going to be inspired to take these ideals and these tactics and try to overthrow their own imperial masters. The Western powers, in particular the ones that own slaves, are of course terrified by this. This is actually one reason, as we might get into in a little bit if we have time, why Americans became much more aggressive towards slaves and took away some of the few freedoms that slaves actually had during this time. Many people were scared that a huge slave revolt like this could spread across the world. So again, very inspiring for oppressed peoples, very frightening for those who wanted to maintain the status quo. Next up, you of course have war in Spain, as you might imagine. In 1808, after Napoleon took power, which we talked about a bit last week, Napoleon invaded Spain and started the Peninsular War. Now, sort of an interesting thing to focus on, what choice did the colonists who live in the Spanish Empire now have? What can they maybe do? Again, yeah, think about you're a Spanish colonist someone living in a Spanish colony. The French have now invaded your mother country, quote unquote. What are you gonna do? Pause for the students at home while I stroke my beard like a Bond villain again. But yeah, some of you might be able to guess. First off, you can of course support your imperial overlords, maybe prove your loyalty and gain some reward as a result. You can join the invader and hope they'll grant you your rights that you want, or you can take advantage of the chaos and try to get your independence. Many people chose this latter option. This led from starting in 1810 a series of Spanish civil wars in places like Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, and Chile. So this is one of the main time periods historians have identified as the point when the Spanish Empire really started to crumble and fall apart. And of course when the British Empire started to take center stage in the world. For example, Independence movements in Argentina started roughly around this time. Argentina originally was a part of a Spanish viceroyalty, which is essentially a name for their colonies, called La Plata, that contained modern-day Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia. Starting in June of 1810, Creoles from a junta formed a junta to reject the local Spanish authorities. A junta is a military group that rules a country by force after taking power. Now, what do you think might be some of the problems here? Pause for you all to consider this back home. All right, think about some more modern examples of military overthrows in places like Africa and other more examples in Latin America. When a military group overthrows the colonizer or some form of government, they typically set up a very oppressive military government. So these juntas that set up military rule typically do not allow much freedom and can often be about as oppressive as the government that was there before. Now, despite this, in 1816, independence was officially declared for Argentina, but some loyalists to the Spanish remained in the northwest of the country. Around this time, José de San Martin became a prominent figure and is still recognized as one of the great heroes of Latin America's independence movement. He joined revolutionary forces in Argentina in 1812, so again, after this junta has been formed to fight against the Spanish authorities, and he liberated Chile in 1818 and Lima, which is, of course, a part of Peru, those of you who are familiar with world geography. Now, a couple of the issues that Argentina had to face after the independence are very characteristic of a lot of these post-independence problems. On the one hand, local Creoles in Peru often rejected Martin's attempts at social reforms. He wanted things like land distribution, more wealth distribution, and things like that to help the poorer classes. Why would these elite Creoles resist that? Pause for the students at home. But yeah, for those of you who remember some of what we talked about earlier in the class, Creoles are the class of individuals in these colonies who are descended from a lot of the original Spanish conquistadors. They're sometimes, of course, mixed with some of the local indigenous peoples, but there's still a lot of Spanish heritage there. They're the elites who usually control most of the wealth and power in the colony. They didn't want to spread any of the wealth that Martin called for. Buenos Aires, which is, of course, the capital of Argentina, actually became an oligarchy after independence, which was led by these Creoles, and indigenous people remained on the periphery. So again, this is a bit of a problem related to the rejection of social reforms. They're, instead of spreading out power and having some sort of true democracy, it's just going from one imperial system to an oligarchy system, which really isn't much of an improvement. Now, because of this, Argentina actually claimed Uruguay as its territory until 1828. So they weren't willing to give the independence they fought for to their neighboring country. Excuse me just one second. In case you haven't noticed, recording these all day totally kills my voice. But as my old soccer coach used to say, we'll play through the pain. But anyway, as a result of this, of the Paraguayan War, which started in 1864, between Brazil and Argentina and Paraguay and Uruguay. During this war, Brazil and Argentina actually united to keep other Latin American countries weak, because typically Brazil and Argentina had been the powerhouses of Latin America. Paraguay and Uruguay were much more weak and less prosperous. Now, what do some of this aftermath reveal about some of the difficulties of post-independence Latin America? I'll give you a second to think on it again, of course. But yes, as you might guess, this shows something I was mentioning a little bit earlier. Just because independence was happening in these countries doesn't mean all of a sudden equality and economic prosperity was going to spread all across the region. A lot of times, the people who still had a lot of the property and had a lot of wealth before independence are still going to maintain access to that wealth, and they're not really sharing this power with the local indigenous populations. So again, freedom doesn't necessarily come along with an independence movement. Brazil, as you might imagine, went through very similar issues. In 1807, actually, Portugal's monarchy in the area fled to Brazil after Napoleon invaded them. So for a while, the Portuguese monarchy was actually located in Brazil. In 1820, the rebels in the country adopted a new constitution and demanded that the monarchy now return back to Portugal. The king did end up leaving, but he put his son, as you can see here, Pedro I, in charge. In 1822, due to various pressures, Pedro declared Brazil independent. However, by 1830 to 1831, revolt broke out against Pedro due to his inability to keep Britain from interfering in the slave trade. Now, the British had actually had ended their own slave trade at this point, and were calling upon the end of the slave trade across for everyone internationally, which had caused slave prices to rise. Why would they be such a problem, particularly for Brazil? Pause for the audience, of course. Yeah, if you remember what we talked about a few weeks ago with the colonization of South America, Brazil's entire economy was dependent upon slaves, and particularly on having access to a constant supply of cheap slaves, because all of their industries and cash crop products were dependent upon slave labor. If you have trouble buying slaves, you're going to lose access to that labor source. So this made Pedro very unpopular due to his inability to protect the slave trade. By 1834, the government had actually given each province their own legislature and had given them a national guard in order to fight these slave mobs. So again, this demonstrates how the government is starting to lose some of its central power, and also the importance to Brazil in preserving the slave trade. They were allowing to let these provinces become as individually powerful in order to protect the slave trade. Of course, though, as you can imagine, Brazil did ultimately have to give up the slave trade. From the 1830s, Brazil actually switched to coffee as its major export, and by 1888, Brazil had officially ended the slave trade. Many planters initially responded by trying to request increased immigration to their provinces. Why would they want to increase immigration now that slavery is over? And I may give you a more relevant example of that question. When immigrants first came to America, a lot of times, for example, what kind of jobs did they get? Pause for the audience, of course. All right, very good, audience at home. I'll assume some of you figured out the answer. Yeah, immigrants typically, when they first get to the country, they a lot of times lack resources and lack wealth in that country, so they have to take the lower paying jobs. Since Brazil no longer had slaves to control, they wanted to bring in immigrants they could now take over these jobs that slaves used to have. These two developments led to a big political divide across the country. The coffee planters in the country wanted to have strong provinces and local militias. Urbanites wanted to have a very strong presidency, they wanted to have a tariff on imports, and they wanted to have a large national army. Why do you think they had this difference in political opinion? And to give you a bit of an example, maybe, think of it like this. It's very similar to the divide that you have between plantation owners in America and the northern cities in America. So again, think about that for a second. All right, it's basically a continuation of those major issues I mentioned before. Like I said, in Brazil, a lot of these local planters and local provinces were getting their own individual power in order to protect themselves from slave revolts. These coffee planters essentially wanted a continuation of that. They wanted the provinces to be individually strong so they can control their own wealth, and local militias to protect themselves from labor uprisings. The Urbanites, or again, those Creoles we mentioned earlier, they wanted a strong presidency so the power could remain in the cities and with the oligarchy. They wanted tariffs on imports, which, if you remember from American history, the North wanted to tax products being shipped into America, so that way the South, who produced all the cash crops, would have to buy finished products from the North. These Urbanites in Brazil wanted the exact same thing. They wanted the coffee planters to be forced to sell their coffee primarily to the North, and they wanted them to have to buy their finished products from the Urbanites as well. In 1889, this led to a compromise where there was a new republic in Brazil, led by a strong president, but also had still strong provisional governors. However, this government was still primarily led by Creoles. So it again shows the amount of influence people of Spanish descent are still able to keep in Latin America. Again, a couple of common characteristics that these revolutions have. What are some, again, of the common problems? Think about this for a second. Yeah, one common theme you might be seeing is the influence of these Creoles, who some of you can see in the forefront of this picture right here. In both Brazil and Argentina, people of Spanish descent are able to keep most of the power in these new governments. So again, in both Brazil and Argentina, even though independence has been achieved from European powers, this new power and political freedom isn't really being shared equally among people across the country. Now, how do you think these problems should be addressed? That's, of course, a much more difficult question, and one that people all across Latin America had to try to deal with. One of those examples is the infamous Bolivar the Liberator, who is another great hero of Latin American independence movements. He was active in what was known as New Granada, which was another viceroyalty of Spain in northern South America. The lower Creole, and this one thing that set this group apart was they had a lower Creole population than La Plata. So how do you think this is maybe going to impact their revolution? Awkward pause again. But yes, as you might imagine, this means there is perhaps more of a chance to avoid having an oligarchy. There's more of an indigenous and lower class population in this colony, so it might have more lower class and indigenous leadership and not just be led by elite Spanish descent individuals. In this movement, you had the emergence of Simon Bolivar, who lived from 1783 to 1830. He was a strong believer in some of the Enlightenment ideals, many of you have probably heard of liberty and popular sovereignty. Now, of course, we're all probably familiar with what liberty means, but what exactly is popular sovereignty? What does that mean? All right, to give you a more modern and America-centered example, because I know a lot of you are probably more familiar with American history, after World War I, many people thought that these former colonies that the Europeans had should be given the right to choose essentially their own system of government and choose their own leaders. This was, of course, known as popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the idea that everyone in every nation has the right to vote and decide on their own form of government and who their leaders are going to be. So again, this demonstrates that this revolution had the potential to be a bit more equality focused and less elitist than some of the previous revolutions, since there was a lower Creole population. By 1816, Bolivar had arrived to New Granada with a military force, which was actually partly supplied by Haiti, and defeated Spanish troops in New Granada in 1819. In 1822, he was named the president of Gran Colombia, which is a new nation that consisted of modern-day Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama. So again, seemingly a very successful revolution at first. However, this success did lead to a clash of ideologies between the two individuals we focused on so far. By 1822, Bolivar and José de San Martin had actually met to discuss how they were going to drive the Spanish out of Peru and Latin America as a whole. Because remember, when we were discussing the Argentina Revolution, there were still loyalists hiding out in the northwest section of this La Plata viceroyalty. During this meeting, they were actually unable to reach an agreement. José de San Martin wanted a strong monarchical rule in Latin America. Why do you think he would want that? Right, again, it's sort of a bit of a testament to the conditions in his country. They were, of course, led by Creoles that already had oligarchies. He wasn't necessarily a huge fan of those. He wanted to try a more monarchy system. Bolivar actually wanted to have republics that were led by Creole oligarchies. Why do you think that's the case? Yeah, again, this shows some of the potential, but also the limitations of his revolutionary goals. He was, again, he did very much like the idea of liberty and popular sovereignty, so he wanted these countries to be able to set up their own republics. However, even he wasn't willing to give up the idea of oligarchies. So essentially you have these two different governmental systems and two governmental goals. After this clash, San Martin actually resigned from politics in 1822, and Bolivar died in 1830 after failing to convince the rest of New Granada to listen to his republic and constitution ideas. After his death, Gran Colombia was actually split up into the modern day countries that we're familiar with today. So again, might be beating a dead horse at this point, but just as another quick reminder, what does this clash reveal about some of the complexities you have to deal with in post-colonial life? Yeah, again, it's just another reminder that just because you have a successful independence movement doesn't mean that all your political problems are over. Even though, for the most part, these guys have been able to defeat their Spanish colonizers, they still couldn't decide what kind of government they wanted to have, and despite some differences, they both still wanted to have very strong governments that didn't necessarily share their political or economic power equally. So just because Latin America was now free from their empires, they still have a lot of issues to deal with, many of which have still continued today. Now, last thing we'll look at is the independence movement in Mexico and America's involvement. The colony of Mexico was called New Spain, which took up modern-day Mexico and portions of Mesoamerica, and had a very small African descent population, but a very large indigenous American population. So, how is that going to maybe affect the Mexican revolutions? And to help with that, compare it to the other two we've talked about, of course. Yeah, very good, students at home. This one especially contrasts with the Brazil revolution issues. Brazil's revolution was, of course, centered around, from the beginning, around either protecting slavery or from dealing with the post-slavery life. This is not something Mexico had to deal with. Their revolution was mostly considered around indigenous American issues. So, by 1810 to 1811, the Mexico Uprising had begun, which was initially led by Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, who lived from 1753 to 1811. During this time, he marched on Guanajuato, which I probably pronounced wrong, in south central Mexico with poor indigenous and Metzio Mexicans. If you remember from last time, Metzio are individuals who have a bit more of a mixed racial or ethnicity background as well. This uprising was initially successful, but Hidalgo actually abandoned his efforts after the indiscriminate killing of Spanish and Creoles executed in 1811. Now, why do you think they might be so violent against these Spanish and these Creoles in particular? Think about what's happened in the aftermath of the other revolutions we've talked about. Pause for the audience again. Alright, yes, fantastic, imaginary audience. Remember what's happened in the past couple of revolutions. When these revolutions end, it's typically the Creoles who take over. So a lot of these poorer classes individuals are trying to take away some of the wealth and take away some of the power through violence of some of these groups. Now, how is that maybe familiar to some issues we face in later history and even sometimes face today? Well, one thing I could compare it to, and just to be clear, I'm not going to take sides on this necessarily. It's not really my job, but it does remind me of how some people get scared of some of the modern-day Black Lives Matter protests and uprisings. A lot of people do get very scared by all the violence that's associated, the destruction of property that tends to be associated, rightly or wrongly, with some of these protest issues. So it shows that that indiscriminate violence has always been something people are scared of, and is always used to discredit some of these movements, again, whether it's the right thing or the wrong thing to do. Eventually, from 1813 to 1821, the Mexican War for Independence finally got started, and this was when Hidalgo's allies called for a new constitution, which was intended to abolish slavery and make all people citizens. By 1821, it was successful, and Mexico established a constitutional empire led by royalist Agustin de Iturbide, probably pronounced that wrong as well, and by 1824 he was overthrown and a Mexican republic was established. This, of course, as many of you know, led to the infamous Mexican-American War. Between the 1820s and the 1830s, Americans in the Southwest would migrate to Mexico for cheap land and political autonomy or freedom. Most of these people brought slaves with them. Why is that going to be such a problem? I stroke my beard every time I have a pause for some reason. I don't know why. I have to do something. But again, it's something we just looked at. After the whole point of the Mexican Constitution, or a big part of it, was to abolish slavery. So since slavery was now gone in Mexico, a lot of Mexicans were offended that these people were ignoring their laws and bringing in slaves. Also, how is Mexico going to react to all this immigration? Think about how, for example, Americans have reacted to immigration to our country at various points in our history. Alright, yeah, this was a pretty simple answer. A lot of them are going to get upset by it as more and more people come in. This, of course, culminated in 1836, when President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna led 4,000 men to attack the Texan and U.S. volunteers at the Alamo. The Texans were defeated by Santa Anna in retaliation. The Texans eventually did defeat Santa Anna in retaliation and declared their own independence. By 1846, the U.S. had actually declared war on Mexico because of a border dispute. They were, of course, victorious and gained over half of all Mexican territory. Now, what does this conflict and these conflicts reveal about other problems Latin Americans have to deal with after independence? All right, again, hopefully the audience at home figured this out, but this is, again, a classic example of foreign interference, which, of course, is going to be a theme in Latin America for pretty much the entire rest of our course. Just because, again, these Latin American countries are now getting independence, it doesn't mean that foreign countries are going to leave them alone. Especially the United States, because, of course, many of these countries are essentially just in our backyard. So just because they're gaining their independence doesn't mean Western powers and powers like America are going to let them have their independence without any issues. Now, one last thing I want you to look at before we go, which I'll have you do on your own time so I don't get copyright striked again. But look over this video if you need Johnny Cash fans on his song Remember the Alamo. Look at some of the lyrics, listen to some of the lyrics, and think to yourself why the Alamo is such a popular part of American history. Why do we love to talk about the Alamo so much? Alright, so again, I wanted to go summarize really quickly some of the common problems all these Latin American revolutions went through in some form or another. Again, the Creoles were the leaders of the most revolutions in Latin America. These were the property owners, the urban citizens, and the professionals. So had professional jobs like doctor, lawyer, things like that made a lot of money. The liberals in these liberation movements were the poor indigenous Americans and the mixed race Metzos. So again, very clear divide here. So a big problem was that the Creoles were the ones who were getting most of the new wealth that was generated from these rebellions, and the poor classes weren't really getting any. The voting rights debate was also a huge issue. Conservative Creoles wanted voting rights based on property and literacy tests. Why do you think that would benefit them so much? Awkward pause for you all at home again. But exactly, very good imaginary audience. It goes back again to the type of government these Creoles were typically setting up. Typically, these Creoles are setting up very powerful oligarchies. Oligarchies are, of course, where just an elite few rule the government. In order to maintain your power, you can only let other elites vote. If these elites are the only ones who get to vote, they're going to keep voting to support these oligarchies. The liberals, of course, wanted voting rights for all males. Since again, they represent the poorer classes and the minority classes, they want to extend voting to everyone so they can get rid of some of these oligarchies. Church and state was also a common issue as well. Conservatives were typically loyal to the Catholic Church and the papacy in these conflicts, and liberals were irritated by the church's refusal to name their own priests and their own bishops. So again, these conservatives, oligarchies, were typically more loyal to the institutions set up in place. The liberal lower classes wanted to overthrow some of these institutions and create something new. So again, just a couple of common issues they all had to deal with. So that's all I have for this one. Just again, remember you have a few important assignments coming up. Please make sure you review especially my writing assignment advice. Keep that in mind for your writing assignment 2 coming up this week. But otherwise, have a great rest of your week, and I'll see you for topic 2.